Okay, welcome to Chapter 36 in the Practices book. This is Centralization Recommendations. It's really just a continuation of the previous chapter. Page 645. So, we talked about platforms and organizations, right? This particular service could be centralized or not, and this particular organization could be centralized or not. Remember, two separate kind of things? Okay, so, architecture. Wouldn't it be nice if you could have strictly centralized stuff? Like every single machine is the exact same vendor, exact same model. You don't have four routers from four different companies. That kind of stuff. Now, I'll confess that in a lot of publicly traded companies and large companies and like the military, that's just not possible. You can't write a set of specifications to say, we want Dell computers. It doesn't work that way. But it sure would be cool. So, more than ever, security is kind of the driving force behind this. I don't want to have 5 different routers or 5 different firewalls. It would take way too much time and energy to spend sending people off to training. Wouldn't it be nice if all the firewalls were the same? That way I could spend less time learning and more time doing. Okay. Some organizations are like a Microsoft shop, which means they choose to have, Microsoft Server and Microsoft Database and Microsoft Email and, Microsoft everything, all the things like that. Microsoft Office for everything rather than doing other things. That would be really cool. So what would happen if you did one of those? You said, well, let's throw in, MySQL, or let's throw in a Linux thing. Well, okay, that you might say, well, using this cheaper product, MySQL is free and Linux is free, so we can save some money. Let's use OpenOffice. In reality, it adds an awful lot of complexity requirements. Things are now a lot more complex to manage. A lot of training requirements, a lot of certification and support. I basically have to have 2 support staffs. One for the Windows world, one for the Linux world. It's actually not worth it. Microsoft even coined this goofy, well, they probably didn't coin the phrase, but they certainly use this phrase called the total cost of ownership. They say, yeah, a free operating system and a free version of Office sounds attractive, but when it sets you back for weeks and weeks and weeks because of productivity issues, it's probably not worth it. Okay, so security, obviously, that's a big business. So from a security point of view, they are definitely thinking strictly centralized, okay? Because for the reasons we just talked about, one global policy for governing access to the corporate resources, okay? Just one. No one else can go in and say, well, yeah, but we didn't like that rule, so we changed it. Nah. And one size should fit all in the security world, if at all possible. And inconsistencies should not be allowed. There's a little shaded area topic coming up here. Very specialized training to get this kind of stuff done. And so I don't want to have each one at the 5 locations be responsible for doing that. And for God's sake, don't have your security person be, other duties as assigned. If they're a security person, then they should do security. Okay, so the inconsistent security policy, that shaded area, page 646. So they had 2 different divisions after a merger. And so one organization was very, very tight, no big deal. And the other one was very loose and had open connections to other things. And when they merged together, since they had inconsistent security policies, somebody with open connections on, Unit B would allow people to get in and get to sensitive information on Unit A. Yeah, that's bad. That's really bad. Authorization on page 646. So you guys know the difference between authentication and authorization, right? Authentication is, who I am, and authorization is what I'm allowed to do, right? So where do you put that? And so one of the ideas is authentication should be strictly centralized. Authentication. I am who I am, like Active Directory. So that ought to be run at one location, right? No big deal. But authorization, that ought to be something where people can go in and say, well, okay, great. Now that I have this authentication system going up, I get to decide who gets permissions on this particular folder. That makes sense, right? So you're just using the resources that were provided to you from a central location, which is what centralized platform is all about. So single sign-on is a typical way you would do that authentication thing. One set of corporate credentials, just like you have at the university, right? You sign in with your, your university email, and you can go get the Canvas, you can go get all these other things. Okay, cool. Let each service provider select the authorization. In other words, I'm down here in Texas, and I want to decide who gets the permissions. Well, I just use their authentication system that they built, and I just plug that into my stuff. Okay, cool. Okay, so extranet. Extranet connections really ought to be centralized. Now, this is where I have a business partnership with somebody else, and I'm letting somebody else into my organization. That is so much fraught with issues, particularly because you essentially have to trust your own security, plus you have to trust somebody else's security. And maybe they're not quite as good as you. And so that is tough. So anything tough ought to be centralized. So access via third parties, both incoming and outgoing, that ought to scare you a little bit. A compound of site security. So yeah, if it's site security, it ought to be centralized. Maybe have a subscription list. Somebody ought to have a list of those places where we allow people in and what they can see. Perhaps even a way to bundle extranet connection. Maybe you can get some cheaper cost if you, instead of having, this company over here has got a lease line to this company, and over here in Minnesota they have a lease line. Maybe you could combine them together and end up with some cheaper price. Data leakage prevention. So they're talking about strictly centralized or centralized with decentralized delegation. Basically, things that happen at the firewall, okay? Data leak prevention. So again, that's highly, highly, highly specialized. And perhaps one organization has got a heck of a lot more secret stuff. Like, I don't know, let's say you have one organization in Minnesota that does research for new products. And so their stuff is significantly more, important than the folks in Texas who are just sales and manufacturing of existing products. So yes, it ought to be centralized if at all possible, but maybe not. Maybe if you have some special requirement, then you still keep it kind of sort of at the top, but you delegate to them. You put people on site in Minnesota and say, okay, you still work for me, but you're the ones that have to decide, how this thing goes. Okay, so infrastructure kind of things. So the items that are available to the whole company, basically what we're talking about. So what things are available to the entire company? Well, obviously the data center, right? The data centers are available to everyone. They're all run the same way. They're from the same design, same procedures, right? Maybe the data retention rules need to be tweaked. Maybe the disaster recovery rules, security. If some of these data centers are in a different area, maybe a different country, maybe some of the rules might be tweaked, which is why they say, well, okay, with decentralized delegation, still run at the top, but we have people on site, okay? Networking, the same thing. A single coherent architecture. It'd be nice if you had all the same vendor, but that's just not possible. And so I'm going to delegate that to the regional teams. It's still going to work for me, but I'm going to have those regional guys operate those switches and those routers, right? Having a single, network operation center, that kind of makes sense, right? With a view of everything. And then you have regional operational centers. So the NOC and the ROC, so the network operating system is responsible for like the WAN parts of the thing, and then the regionals would be responsible for the LAN parts of things. That kind of makes sense. Okay, good. IP addresses, yeah, strictly centralized. Just like the Highlander movies. There can only be one. If you're going to be passing out IP addresses, you're going to have one setup. You cannot have that. So all run, organized at the top, but each one of the states have a pool of IP addresses that have been assigned by somebody at the top. Namespaces, kind of sort of the same thing. DNS can be delegated, but it's really, really sensitive, right? So same kind of thing. They're saying strictly centralized because most of the time you won't be doing anything to namespaces. You set up your, I know I'm speaking Greek here, but you set up your DHCP servers to update the DNS, and the DNS is going to be Active Directory integrated, and therefore they replicate, so there's really not much to do. Communications. So email, chat, video conferencing, voice over IP, since they're provided to everyone in the entire organization, then that ought to be centralized, or at least centralized platform. Maybe you don't want to use or don't have voice over IP in your organization. So these are the services that are available. You can choose to use them. Remember, that's what that platform is all about. Data management, again, storage and backup. You could use their services, all, part, none. Okay, makes sense. Provided all. It does require some professionals, and you may have some legal requirements for backup scenarios that are different than the corporate standards. Okay, yeah. The whole idea of like folder redirection and roaming profiles, so that if somebody, remember the talk about, the laptop and, how easy it was to get the laptop back after a disaster. Yeah, that's the kind of thing we're talking about. If that was being done someplace, that'd be cool. Okay, monitoring. So monitoring is a little different. First of all, what are you going to be monitoring? How am I going to do it? Are there the monitoring plugins? How frequently things monitor? Which data we're going to return? Blah, 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 blah. So let's say we don't even have to talk centralization, decentralization. I had half a dozen or so servers and, a couple hundred PCs. And when I would get in the morning, I would go look at a consolidated log report, because we had all the log files from all the PCs and all the servers pulled into a single log service. It went through and weeded out the information kind of things, picked out the things that were, severe errors. And so I would get in the morning and that's one of the first things I would do. I had to get an email saying, hey, here's your daily log report. And so I'd bring that thing up and it would basically give me a summary of everything that was in there. That's pretty doggone cool. Because if something's going to be going wrong, you kind of sort of need to know it. I do not want to wait until machine crashes to go look through the log files to see what happened. I want to see the log files weeks and weeks and weeks before it crashes, right? And without a centralized log management system, I would have no choice but to visit every single machine and bring up the event viewer and look at the logs. Wow. That's just not enough time in the day to do that. So centralized log management, excellent idea. Okay. So they recommend a centralized platform, but I kind of disagree. If it's going to be security related, then I don't want you to opt out of it. The security related parts, no, absolutely not. Not platform. I want strictly centralized. For everything else, then yeah, you can have it centralized platform. Okay. So log files are kind of sort of different. Alrighty. So moving on. Support. So where is your help desk? This could be logically centralized, but not physically. In other words, maybe you have a centralized help desk, but maybe it's contracted out, right? It's not even belong to you. Not even your employees, right? But it's centralized in spirit, okay? All right, so help desk. So this is where there ought to be one phone number to call, one ticketing system on the web, and that's it. Don't make it more complicated. Don't say, oh, well, if you're in Texas, you call this number. If you're in Minnesota, you call. No. One help desk. One single knowledge base. When things go wrong, people start collecting information like, ooh, the last time this happened, we did this and it fixed it. Again, centralized management. If everyone reports problems and they're kind of sporadic, the only way you could see a trend is if you looked at them all. People in Texas wouldn't have enough data to be able to see a trend. Okay, kind of makes sense. End-user support. The most important factor that people have for determining the quality, how happy they are with the IT program is end-user support. All right, hang on a second. We're almost at the 15-minute mark.